now, right? I will attempt to recall details of my life that might interest you. I now live at the Scandinavian Assisted Living Facility at 50 Warwick Avenue, apartment 302 in Cranston, Rhode Island. I moved here when they opened in 1982 after living at 104 Woodstock Lane for 44 years. I will be 88 years old in January 1997. Now I gotta turn off. I'm not ready to keep on. Well, I guess I am. My mother was the oldest child in the Chauvin family. There were 8 girls and 1 boy. 2 of the girls died when they were children. The son, when he was 25 years old, he was engaged to be married when he had appendicitis, and peritonitis set in, from which he died. This was before penicillin was discovered. My mother was born on March 31st, 1884. Her father was a school teacher. He made extra money making caskets and wooden shoes and did some farming. The country schools only taught through elementary grade, so in order to go to higher education, one needed to move to the city. Mother wanted to go to America, so she worked in a porcelain factory to earn her passage and borrowed some money from her grandmother, which she repaid later. It was about 1901 when Mother came to America at 17 years of age. She traveled with a cousin who was also named Gerda. Mother didn't know any English and knew no one in America. They went to Worcester, Mass. I do not know why Worcester, except possibly because her cousin knew a young man who had been to America. He probably suggested that they go to Worcester. I do not know what brought Mother to Providence, except perhaps she heard it was a good place to get work. There were many jobs for domestics in those days: cooks, seamstresses, cleaning girls, nursemaids, and so forth. The east side was where many of the wealthy families lived. The only family Mother talked about was the Swansons. Mother was the nursemaid, and she took care of their 2 boys, Howard and Hugh Henry. Mr. Swanson was Swedish. Mrs. Swanson was not. They were wonderful to their help. Mr. Swanson was part owner of several food markets in Providence. They lived on Humboldt Avenue on the east side of Providence. The house is still there in 1996. Mother and Dad met at a social, at a lunch for 2, and their name card inside. My dad bought a basket decorated with blue and yellow ribbons, the colors of the Swedish flag. He didn't know the girl whose name was in the basket, and after locating her, they ate lunch and made plans to meet again. They were married in March 1907. My grandfather, Peterson, came to Providence, Rhode Island, and opened a tailor shop with another tailor on Broad Street in Providence. I know very little about this. My dad, Eric Huger,
keep going, Mom.
had a brother and 4 sisters. The brother came to USA, but the family doesn't know what became of him. He just disappeared. 2 sisters remain in Sweden. Amanda and Olga came to America. They never married, and they lived and worked together. They opened Peterson's Variety Store at 771 Hope Street in Providence, Rhode Island, for a number of years, and they sold the business in 1938 and moved to Potter's Avenue, Providence, where they lived for the rest of their lives. They died within a week or so of each other and are buried in the New Patuxent Cemetery, same grave plot as my parents. They were in their 80s. One of the sisters in Sweden never married. She owned a dry goods store in Hampstead. She was very successful. The other sister married a man who operated a lumberyard. They had twin girls, Martha and Inga, and a son named Tori. When Russell and I went to Sweden in 1972, we visited all three of them. We stayed, oh, I lost my place now. We stayed with Martha and her husband, Carl Orkey, who lived in an 11-room parsonage. Both twins married ministers. Carl Orkey was a Domprost, a D-O-M-P-R-O-S-T, in the Cathedral of Skara. We visited their home and churches. About my growing up, I was the only child for about 10 years, and in the family until my cousin Sigvard was born to my mother's sister Amanda. Next was brother Ralph, born in 1919. Later Jimmy, and then Philip and Barbara were born to Albertina. Data Sigvard. Alice and Hope were Sigvard's sisters. Annie in Sweden had a son, and Alice, the other sister of my mother, had no children. Alice came to America a couple of times, and she learned some English here so she could understand. My mother never saw Annie, and that was because she never went back to Sweden. Because I was older than my brother and cousins, I didn't have much in common with them. I went to work when I was 16 years old in an office in Providence Box and Lumber Company. This was the only place I worked for the next 11 years. Ralph married Stacia Stenbeck, and they have one son and 3 daughters. One vacation I went to Hampton Beach in New Hampshire with a schoolmate. It was there I met Russell. At the time, his sister Marjorie was very ill, so it wasn't until a month or so later that Russell called me and made a date. We continued to date, and in 1936 we were married in People's Church in Cranston. And the snaps of our wedding picture group were taken in the Rose Garden at Roger Williams Park. And later we went to a restaurant in Bristol, Rhode Island. We took the boat from Bristol to New York, where the car was already on the boat. And we went for our honeymoon in the convertible. I was asked to come back to work at Providence Box and Lumber Company, and they offered Russell a job as a lumber salesman if I would come. And we were living in Jamaica Plain at the time. We moved to Greenwood Street, and next house to where Mother and Dad lived. Gail was born August 2nd, 1938. A lovely baby, weighed 8 pounds 5 ounces. Unfortunately, she became ill while still in the hospital. She had major surgery at 2 weeks old. Gallbladder and appendix were removed. She came home about 2 weeks later. From then on, she died until she died on February 6, 1939. She had periods of being ill and periods of feeling well. This was a hard period in all our lives. We had an autopsy performed, and it was cystic pancreas was the diagnosis. We decided to have a house built, and we looked in Dean Estates and down in Greenwood, and decided on Greenwood. We moved to our little house at 37 Oak Hill Avenue in September 1939. Our new next-door neighbors were Margaret and Claude and Chris Wixie. While we lived in Greenwood, there was a war going on, the Second World War. Russell was rejected by the service because a spot in his lung. None of our close friends had him to go in the service. Ralph went into the Merchant Marines, and Jimmy was in the Navy. Food, some clothes, cars, tires, and so forth were rationed. A struggle to get meat, butter, sugar, and fruit. Ready? We spent 9 happy years in our little home. Both Rodney and Marcia were born there. Now our little home was too small. Should we build in Greenwood or move back to Cranston? We had made good friends in the 9 years in Greenwood, especially Rose and Harry Abbott and Eddie, and then Margaret and Claude Whitsey with Chris, Andrea, and Peter. Russell left it to me to decide. It was a hard decision to make. We decided to build in Cranston. Russell knew contractors and owners of land in Dean Estates. They wanted him to live there and gave us a very attractive price on the land and also the house. We decided on 104 Woodstock Lane. We were the first family to move in on that side of Woodstock Lane, which went down to Oaklawn Avenue. At first, Rodney and Marcia were very lonesome for their old playmates. Rodney met a couple of boys at school, a second grade at Mechanic School. Marcia played with Donnie Palmery next door. Finally, met little girls in school, kindergarten. We joined Mechanic Church and met the Walkers, and Marcia met Susan, and Rod met her brother Reed. We met, Russ and I knew the Pennock, Helen and Lyle. The Pennock, we played cards almost every Saturday night. We also took many trips together. There was no Garden City when we moved to the hill, not at all convenient for shopping or anything. Needed a car. Russ finally advanced at the bank and got the use of a car, no expense to us. That was great. Russ got me a new black Plymouth, a 4-door in 1949. Both Rodney and Marcia went to Bain. Rod went to Cranston High East and Marcia to a new school called West. Rodney went to Colby in Maine, and Marcia went to Westbrook for about 1 month. Came home and went to work at a Beaker insurance company, where she worked until she married. Rodney met Sheila Webster, and they married, and when he became a pilot in the Air Force, they moved to California. Michael and the twins were born in California. Marcia and Steve were married in '67, and Steve was in the Navy. Amanda was born in Rhode Island, and then they moved to California. Russell did well at work and rose in rank to vice president, later to senior vice president. But during that period, Russ had headaches, which were unbearable. He went to many doctors, and finding that Dr. John Graham from Faulkner Hospital in Jamaica Plain, Mass. This doctor used many experimental drugs, and Russell was a willing patient. He got relief, but no cure. During this time, Russell had brain surgery at Mary Hitchcock Hospital in New Hampshire. This operation was not successful. However, with different medicines, Russ got some relief. Russ was selected Headache Man of the Year. Dr. Graham visited Russell in the final illness, a wonderful doctor and friend. Cluster headaches was what he had. Russell died at Haiti-Eyed Nursing Home on July 9, 1984. We had an impressive memorial service at Mechanic Park Church in the evening of July 12, 1984. I stayed on at 104 Woodstock Lane until I sold the house and moved to the assisted living on Broad Street. And then I changes over the years. Mother told me that when I was a little girl, my dad changed jobs, and the place that wasn't, if the place wasn't within walking distance, they moved the curtains and the shades and everything, and that was quite an undertaking. Mail was delivered twice a day, and there was a milkman who delivered our milk and cream every day. There was an egg man, an ice man, a fish man, a delivery of meat and food from Providence markets. Our biggest department store in Providence delivered items by truck, clothes, dry goods, furniture, and so forth, items costing $1 or over. Stores, the outlet, and the Boston store, Gladding's. There were no supermarkets or malls. In a grocery store, one took turns and waited on by a store manager or a clerk. We carried the groceries home in paper bags, and stores were not open on Saturday afternoon or Sunday. Refrigerators were called ice boxes. The ice was put in a compartment on top, and beneath the shelves with the food, and underneath was a large container to hold water from melted ice. These boxes were usually in the back hall where there was no heat. Heat was supplied mostly by the black stove, which ran special coals. Also, the oven was used for baking. Hot water supplied in large tea kettles on top of the stove. Later, a vacuum heater was, if lucky. Every evening, the stove was polished for lighting for the next day. Baths and the bathroom was heated by a portable heater, and the water was heated in tea kettles. One cold winter, we had our Christmas tree up until spring. That was because not all the rooms had heat. Cars were called machines. There was one color, black. Not many people owned one. We finally had a 1912 Ford Touring, second-hand. It had a sideboard to step on when getting in and out. The tires were very small around, had lots of flats. Later, it took us about 3 hours to get to Scarborough Beach, and we sometimes walked up the hills. When it rained, we had side curtains to snap on to the leather-like roof of the car. They were isinglass to let in some light, no plastic then. I can remember when I had first had a windshield wiper, had to work it by hand. I'm reading from my notes, and they're not very good. Some brands of cars, Ford, Chevrolet, Dodge, Hudson, Buick, Packard, T.S. Arrow, and Rolls-Royce. Steve was in the Navy. Amanda was born in Rhode Island, and later they moved to Chula Vista, California. Eric was born in California. They moved to Bainbridge Island, and we visited them in each year place. In May 1972, Russ and I went to Sweden. Russ planned the trip, which took us to visit my mother's home, her church, and her 2 sisters and a nephew. We went to my dad's relatives, my twin cousins and the butler, all married with families. We visited Oriforce Glass Factory and showroom, bought some items for gifts. We went to Denmark, took in Tivoli Park and the castles, and left on the train to go to Germany, to Switzerland. Beautiful scenery and relaxing drive. We had a car. left from Switzerland and flew to the USA. Mother stayed with Masha in her home. Russ traveled for the bank to many places. I went to Alaska, Anchorage, Fairbanks, and then to California to visit Marcia, Steve, and family in one trip. Rodney was captain of the famous B-52 plane at age 26. We went to visit them at that time. Rod and family moved to Limestone, Maine from California. And he got out of the Air Force because Sharon needed special schools and so forth. She had cerebral palsy. Rod worked at People's Bank at first and then moved to Hanover, New Hampshire, Dartmouth Savings, and next to Stafford Springs, Connecticut. Rodney and Sheila were divorced. Rodney had custody of the children. Rodney married Trudy Hemelgarn, who was divorced and had 3 children. Trudy ultimately died of a brain tumor after 6 years of marriage, which was shocking. Rod was been very successful and rose to the top in rank at the Stafford Savings Bank. He lives in a lovely home in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. Marcia worked at a Meeker insurance company until she had Amanda, and then they moved to California. Eric was born in California, and Stephen was in the Navy. The next move was to Bainbridge Island, where they live at present. Marcia is now an agent for an insurance company. Steve works on the Trident program, and he will soon retire. I'm very proud of my children and grandchildren. They have been very successful in school and in their work. They and their mates are good and look so also. My 2 little great-granddaughters, Samantha and Taylor, are adorable. A proud and happy mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. Mom, Nino, Nana, and great-grandmother.
Very good, Mom. The recording was made on March the 22nd, 1997, and I hope the recording came out well enough to hear. We'll have to check on it. Thank you, Mom.
Mr. Fixer.
It must have been that you'd gone, I think so, because one's blank and the other isn't.
Yeah.
No, this will all be going in there, though. Do they stay down?
It's still going.
Okay, so I'll leave you.
All right. Come and visit again. Now I just talk, right?
Yeah.
With Martha and Carl Orkey, who lived in an 11-room parsonage. Both twins married ministers. Carl Orkey was a Domprost in the Cathedral of Skara. We visited their houses of worship. Farfar, grandfather, Peterson, came to Providence and was a partner with another tailor. They had a shop on Broad Street in Providence. I do not know much about this. I gave my brother, whose name is Ralph, a business card that had a name and address on it. About my growing up, I was the only child in the family for about 10 years until my cousin Sigvard was born to my mother's sister Amanda. Next was my brother Ralph, born December 22nd, 1919. 11 years younger than I am. Later, Jimmy of Malibu was born to Albertina. Then Day to Sigrid, and Philip and Barbara to Albertina. Alice and Hope were Sigrid's sisters and Amanda's daughters. Annie in Sweden had a son. His name was Svante. Alice, the youngest sister, had no children. Alice came to America a couple of times. My mother never saw Annie or Alice. Alice came to America, so that is how we got acquainted with her. Because I was older than my cousins and brother, I didn't have much in common with them. I went to work when I was 16 years old in an office, Providence Box and Lumber Company. This was the only place I worked for the next 11 years. One vacation, I went to Hampton Beach in New Hampshire with a schoolmate. It was there I met Russell. At that time, his sister Marjorie was very ill, so it wasn't until a month or two later that Russell called me and made a date. We continued to date, and on June 20th, 1936, we were married in People's Church in Cranston. The reception was in the church parlor, with a collation being punch, cake, and ice cream. This was Depression days. Took snaps in the Rose Garden and at Roger Williams Park. Later, we went to a restaurant in Bristol. The reason for that was that we wanted to take our car on the boat that went to New York. And so during the day of the wedding, Russell put the car on the boat, and after the wedding, we went to this restaurant with our friends. They paid their own way. I'm looking for my notes. My dad, Eric Hugo, had a brother and 4 sisters. The brother came to the United States, but no one knows what became of him. He just disappeared. 2 sisters remained in Sweden. The other 2, Amanda and Olga, came to America. Never married. They lived together. They opened the Peterson's Variety Store at 771 Hope Street in Providence, and later in 1936 went to Sweden to visit, therefore missing our wedding. They came back to the United States and worked another 2 years before selling the business and retiring. They died within a couple of years of each other in their 80s. They were buried in the same plot as my parents in New York, in New Patuxent Cemetery, Warwick. The other sister owned a dry goods store. I believe it was in Helmstone, and it was very successful. The other one married a man who owned a lumber company. They had twin girls, Marta and Inga, and a boy named Tori. When Russell and I went to Sweden in 1972, we stayed with Marta and the Domprus, Carl Orke Henningsen of Skara. We visited all 3 cousins and saw the churches where they were. Well, I've lost my place again, where they served. Russ and I went to live in an apartment in Jamaica Plains, Mass. He was still working for the AMPT company at that time. And then I was asked to come back to work at the office at Providence Box and Lumber, and they offered Russell a position to train as a lumber salesman. We were happy to go back to Cranston. and we moved into a place on Orchard Street, off Park Avenue. I worked until I became pregnant. Gail was born August 2nd, 1938. A lovely baby, weighed 8 pounds and 5 ounces. Unfortunately, she became ill while still in the hospital. She had major surgery at 2 weeks old. Gallbladder and appendix were removed. She came home about 2 weeks later. From then on, until she died on February 6th, she had periods of being ill and feeling well. This was a hard period in all our lives. We had an autopsy performed. The result said cystic pancreas, and so that is what I guess it was. We decided to have a home built, and we looked in the Dean Estates and down in Greenwood for a lot. Decided on Greenwood. Moved into our small house at 37 Oak Hill Avenue in September 1939. New next-door neighbors were Margaret, Claude, and Chris Witzy. While we lived in Greenwood, there was a war going on, the Second World War. Russell was rejected by the service because of a spot on his lung. None of our close friends had to go into the service. Ralph went into Merchant Marines, and Jimmy May went into Navy. Food and clothes, some clothes, cars, tires, gasoline, and so forth were rationed. A struggle to get meat, butter, sugar, and fruit was an everyday problem. We spent 9 happy years in our little home. Both Rodney and Marcia were born there. Now our little home was too small. Should we build in Greenwood or move back to Cranston? We had made good friends in the 9 years in Greenwood, especially Rose and Harry Abbott and son Eddie, Margaret and Claude Witzy with Chris, Andrea, and Peter. Russell left it to me to decide. It was a hard decision to make. Russell went to work at Old Colony in 1945. He became a secretary and then a vice president and executive vice president. After much thought, I guess I skipped a bit, but we decided to build in Cranston. At that time, the schools were considered better there, which was to be considered. Russell knew contractors and owners of land in Dean Estates. They wanted him to live there and gave us very attractive prices on the land and also the house. We decided on 104 Woodstock Lane. We were the first family to move in on that side of Woodstock Lane in 1948, Woodstock Lane went down to Oaklawn Avenue. At first, Rodney and Marcia were very lonesome for their old playmates. Rodney met a couple of boys at school, second grade at Mechanical Park School. Marcia played with Donnie Palmley next door. Finally met little girls in school, kindergarten. We joined Mechanical Park Church and met the Walkers. Marcia met Susan, and Rod met her brother, Reed. Russ and I both were friends of Penix, Helen and Lyle, so we adjusted. Penix were friends of ours from way back. We got together each week and went on many trips together. There was no Garden City when we moved on the hill, not at all convenient for shopping or anything. Needed a car. Russ finally advanced at the bank and got to use a car, no expense to us. That was great. Russell got me a new black Plymouth, a 4-door, in 1949. I loved that car. Marcia had to go to several different schools, and finally, when Woodridge was built, she was there a couple of years. Both Rodney and Marcia went to Bain. Rod went to Cranston High East and Marcia to the new school called West. Rodney went to Colby College in Maine, and Marcia went to Westbrook for about 1 month. She came home and went to work at a Meeker Insurance Company, where she worked until she married. Rodney met Sheila Webster at Colby. They married when he graduated and became a pilot in the Air Force. They moved to California. Michael and the twins were born out there. Marcia and Steve married in 1967. Steve was in the Navy, and they moved to California. Amanda was born in Rhode Island, and Steve was in the Navy and moved to California eventually. Eric was born in California. Russell did well at work and rose in rank to vice president, later to senior vice president. But during that period, Russell had headaches that were unbearable, and he went to many doctors and finally met Dr. John Graham from Faulkner Hospital in Jamaica Plain, Mass. This doctor used many experimental drugs, and Russell was a willing patient. He got relief, but no cure. During this time, Russ had been brain surgery at Mary Hitchcock Hospital in New Hampshire. This operation was not successful. However, with different medicines, Russ got some relief. Russ was selected as Headache Man of the Year, and Lynn Peterson went with us when they presented him with a little memento. Marcia has it. Dr. Graham visited Russell a couple of times in his final illness, a wonderful doctor and friend. Russell died at Hattie Eye Nursing Home on July 9, 1984. We had an impressive memorial service at Meshanica Park Church in the evening of July 12, 1984. I stayed on at 104 Woodstock Lane for 44 years until November 30th, 1992. I had sold the house and moved to Scandinavian Assisted Living, a brand new place at 50 Broad Street in Cranston. I guess that about does it as to what I did and when. But I have many notes that I made, changes over the years. Mother told me that when I was a little girl, when my dad changed places of employment, he was a patent maker in a factory, Brown and Sharp, a Grinnell Company, Universal Winding, United Wire. And when he changed jobs, we moved. And if the new place wasn't within walking distance, that was the reason. It meant taking the curtain rods, the curtains, the shades, the sliding screens, and so forth to each place. It wasn't easy. Let's see. In 1936, 1948, and 1984, over the years, mail was delivered twice a day. There was a milkman who delivered our milk and cream every day. Later years, milk was put in an insulated box in the back breezeway. There was an egg man, a grocery man, an ice man, a fish man, a delivery of meat and food from the Providence markets. Our biggest department stores in Providence delivered items by truck. Clothes, dry goods, furniture, small items costing $1 or more. The stores were the Outlet, the Boston Store, Gladding's. There were no supermarkets or malls. In a grocery store, one took turns being waited on by a store manager or a clerk. And then you carried the items home in paper bags. Stores were closed on Sundays. Before 1936, refrigeration refrigerators were called ice boxes. The ice was put in the compartment on top. Beneath were shelves for food, and underneath was a large container to hold water from melted ice. These boxes usually in the back hall where there was no heat. We also had the Iceman. Heat was supplied mostly by the black stove, which burned special coal. Also, the oven was used for baking. Hot water supplied in large tea kettles on top of the stove. Later, a vacuum heater, if lucky. Every morning, the stove was polished before lighting. Bars. Bars were, the bathroom was heated with a portable stove, the kerosene heat, and several tea kettles of water was heated on the stove, then delivered to the bathroom. Very little water in the tub. One cold winter, we had our Christmas tree set up until spring. Cars were called machines. There was one color, black. Not many people owned one. We finally had a 1912 Ford Touring, secondhand. It had a sideboard to step on when getting in and out. The tires were very small around. Had lots of flats. It took us about 3 hours to get to Scarborough Beach, and we sometimes walked up big hills. When it rained, we had side curtains to snap on to the leather-like roof of the car. They had isinglass, no plastic then, to let some light in when being used. I can remember when we first had a windshield wiper, had to push by hand. Brands of the cars were Ford, Chevrolet, Dodge, Hudson, Buick, Packard, Pierce Arrow, and Rolls-Royce. In May 1972, Russ and I went to Sweden. Russ planned the trip, which took us to visit my mother's home, her church, and her 2 sisters and a nephew. We went to my dad's relatives and his 2 sisters and a nephew. We went to, I guess I'm repeating myself. So we visited the famous Orrefours glass factory and showroom, bought items for gifts. We went to Denmark and took in Tivoli Park and the castles. Left on train at night through Germany on to Switzerland. Beautiful scenery and a relaxing drive. We rented a car. Left from Switzerland and flew back to the USA. My mother stayed with Marcia in our home. Russ traveled for the bank to many places. I went to Alaska, Anchorage, and Fairbanks, and then to California to visit Marcia, Steve, and family on one of the trips. Rodney was captain of the famous B-52 plane at age 26. I went to California to help out when emergencies arose or just to visit. Rod and family moved to Limestone, Maine, from California, and later got out of the Air Force because Sharon needed special schools and so forth. She had cerebral palsy.